One's awareness, we have both English and Spanish captioning. You should be able to turn the captioning on at the bottom of your screen. We also have an ASL interpreter team who will be interpreting on screen. If you are having any technical issues, please type in the chat and our staff will try to help you. Again, welcome. My name is Nicole-Ian Dumoulin. I am the Senior Vice President for Rights and Justice here at the Center for American Progress. And 32 years ago, the ADA was signed into law. It was a benchmark piece of legislation which legally prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability and guaranteed disabled people access to the same opportunities as non-disabled people. The ADA was hard fought and won by a diverse coalition of people, yet barriers continue to exist for disabled people in society today, particularly multi-marginalized disabled people. Individuals still face discrimination at work, at stores, in their communities, and even within the places they call home. More recently, attention has turned to the US immigration system and how disabled refugees and immigrants are treated. News headlines from the past 6 years describe horrific conditions at detention facilities, resulting in medical neglect and death of individuals with disabilities and chronic illnesses. In 2017, a disabled 10-year-old immigrant, Rosa Maria Hernandez, caught media attention as ICE chased down her ambulance. Her family was trying to get her emergency surgery to remove her gallbladder. These stories are just the tip of the iceberg. Due to fleeing from violence, many asylum seekers have disabilities, yet the US has been unable to truly accommodate their needs and protect their rights. Today, we will be hearing from 3 individuals who have been working in the field and on the front lines to help disabled asylum seekers. They will be discussing the barriers disabled asylum seekers face and the tools that have been utilized to help protect their rights. But before you meet them, let me introduce my colleague, Mia Ives-Rublé, the Director of the Disability Justice Initiative here at the Center for American Progress, who will be moderating today's panel. Mia has worked in the disability community for over 20 years, helping individuals get connected to services in their community and to push for improved policies that better protect the disabled community. More recently, Mia has been working with immigration groups to help build coalitions and improve understanding of how disability and immigration intersect. Mia, I'll leave it to you to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for those introducing words. And I am super proud to be able to introduce some amazing speakers who are going to talk a little bit about the work that they have been doing. So first, I wanted to introduce Michelle Garcia. Michelle is the manager of organizing and community development at Access Living. Michelle has worked for Access Living since 2009 when she joined staff as the Latinx community organizer. As a community organizer, Michelle is responsible for increasing the number of Latinx leaders with disabilities and raising awareness in the Latinx community around disability issues, including immigration and healthcare. In 2021, Michelle was promoted to the role of manager of organizing and community development and took on a new position of leadership within the Access Living's advocacy department. Michelle has collaborated with many others working in the Latinx community and has helped expand their knowledge about disability-related issues. The next person that I would like to introduce is Professor Arlene Cantor, who is the director of the Disability Law and Policy Program at Syracuse University. Professor Cantor is the founder and director of the College of Law's Disability and Law and Policy Program and the faculty director of international programs. Cantor is an internationally acclaimed expert in international and comparative disability law. She publishes and lectures extensively on domestic and international human rights and disability law and policy. Her recent book, The Development of Disability Rights Under International Law from Charity to Human Rights, traces the development of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. From 2001 to 2006, Professor Cantor worked with the UN Committee on drafting the CRPD. Since then, she has worked with governments and disability organizations on implementing the CRPD in more than a dozen countries. She has been invited to speak at the UN General Assembly, the Committee of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. She is currently an expert consultant to the UN on disability, as well as several international and domestic disability organizations. The last person that I'd like to introduce is Kelsey, who is the Disability Rights Policy Analyst at the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, and is the policy analyst. And Anne has worked on disability and health rights issues for nearly a decade. She has previously held positions at the Center for HIV Law and Policy, Disability Rights New York, the Community Service Society of New York, and at Disability Rights Advocates. Anne received her JD from Fordham University School of Law and her undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia. So welcome. And I'm just so honored to be able to host this panel with you all and discuss a very important topic around disabled asylum seekers. So my first question is we know that individuals with disabilities face many barriers within the United States, but when we talk about disabled immigrants and what they face throughout the asylum process, I'd love to hear your opinions or what you found that disabled asylum seekers have been facing as they go through the system. And we can start with Michelle.
Thank you, Mia. So from a personal perspective and what I've seen on the ground, when I work with the folks that have come to me, they usually come needing supports and services when they come to me. And so they are looking for, how to get any supports and services. So what I've seen is that the lack of supports and services for immigrants with disabilities. And so we start by figuring out what are the needs of the folks and where do we start to get those needs met, or how do we get those needs met? So we do a very in-depth kind of, we have an in-depth conversation with those folks. We have what we call a one-on-one with them to make sure that we meet those expected needs. So I've seen, for example, folks that need medical supplies, medical equipment, and that is very hard to come by for folks who need supports. So we've had to have connections with organizations that provide those medical supplies and medical equipment basically for free, which again is hard to come by. But we've been able to supply some folks that needed, luckily, with what they needed, like wheelchairs, walkers, and other medical supplies and equipment. From refugees and asylum seekers that have come to us, even though they are in that process and that they could qualify for some supports, they still, they're afraid of asking for supports. So we have to be very mindful of that fact that they do qualify for some supports, and that the fear is real. And so we have to let them know, okay, so you do qualify for some services and supports. Yes, we understand that you don't want to apply for them because the fear is there. And so we gain their trust in order for them to apply for whatever they do qualify for. And for whatever they don't qualify, we try to go above and beyond to get their needs met, for housing, for healthcare, for sure. I mean, we see a lot of healthcare needs that need to be met, and we want to get those healthcare needs met as quickly as possible. And then we go and refer them to other needs like housing, like I was mentioning, and other needs that need to be met as quickly as possible as well. But I think first and foremost coming in is that trust that you build with the person, right? Because they don't know who they're trusting to tell, I'm an immigrant, I'm a refugee, what do I qualify for in this country? So that's where I would see what my response would be.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sure getting individuals sort of signed up for services and helping them understand sort of which services that they are eligible, particularly when laws change and different policies change. I think it must be essential to be able to provide that accurate information and build that trust. So thank you so much for sharing that. Professor Cantor, I would love to hear from your perspective. So, you've done some research, some extensive research on this population, and would love to hear from you on sort of what barriers have you seen people face, particularly around the legal system as they're going through the asylum process.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Michelle mentioned, I mean, we can have good laws that provide services, but making those laws work for people remains a challenge. So I'd say the biggest barrier, I think, for protection of the rights of disabled asylees and refugees in general is the law. On one hand, the law opens up opportunities, it guarantees rights. On the other hand, it can act as a barrier. And in this case, for many decades, it did. The Americans with Disabilities Act is fabulous. It recognizes the rights of people with disabilities and how we should fight ableism in all aspects of our society. But the immigration laws, historically, were quite racist. And not only that, but designed to keep people out, not to help people enter. And so for many decades, people had to show persecution according to the law in order to qualify for asylum or withholding of removal for people in the States. You have to show persecution that you suffered in the past or you'll face in the future. Well, people with disabilities had been persecuted and still are in institutions in many countries of the world. But people with disabilities were never considered a certain group entitled to protections until very recently. And so the law itself had been a barrier. In order to show persecution, you had to show political beliefs, for example, and that often didn't apply to people with disabilities. So when the immigration laws started opening up, particularly for LGBTQ members of the community and other groups, the idea was that we could argue that people with disabilities constitute what's called a particular social group, which is the persecution has to be directed to that group in order to qualify for asylum. And there was a case that I helped bring in 2000, the first case that recognized that disability can be a particular social group. And I'll just summarize by saying that in order to remain in the United States, and there's asylum, there's withholding of removal, there's also the Convention Against Torture, which prevents the United States from returning anyone to any country if they may suffer torture in that country. And to the extent that the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has found that in some cases institutionalization in involuntary treatment can amount to torture, arguably the United States government should not be returning individuals with disabilities to countries where they may be institutionalized and face torture there. But that's a very high standard, tough to show. And I also want to mention that the United States is a signatory of the optional protocol for refugees. Since 1967, the US has an obligation to refuse to send anyone back to their country where they may face persecution. So we have these laws that sound great that should be protecting disabled immigrants and asylee applicants and refugees generally. But to make them work for disabled people has been a challenge. And that's why I'm really happy, I have to say, to be here today and want to recognize the Center for American Progress and the work you're doing to raise awareness about the importance of all lawyers and advocates on this relationship between the rights of people with disabilities under our immigration laws that extend beyond and separate from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I'm going to stop there. I can talk a little bit more about some of the cases. I'll just mention one more thing, which is, as Mia mentioned, I've constantly been reviewing all of the cases by people with disabilities in which they seek asylum or withholding of removal. And there are more and more cases every year, which is encouraging. On the other hand, there are fewer and fewer cases that hold for the individual and grant their right to stay. And the two biggest challenges I'll just summarize here. And number one, how do you prove persecution in that homeland? You have a person with a disability or who comes here somehow, some miracle that they're here, escaping in some cases institutionalization. How does that person have the evidence on them to show persecution? We need experts. We need experts to help in these cases. The second barrier is that people with disabilities, on one hand, face enormous discrimination and mistreatment and ableism because they are disabled people. On the other hand, the immigration courts are trying to look for something specific about that person that would qualify them for persecution. So in some cases, it's a no-win, very difficult situation to show you're a member of the particular group that has suffered discrimination. And we've been successful. There have been cases on behalf of people with schizophrenia, with other types of disabilities, where they have been granted asylum. So we have to keep up the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think one of the things that sort of resonates with me is just the fact that these individuals have rights. And so often there's this assumption that they have no rights, right? When they are undocumented individuals, but the understanding that there are different legal strategies that can be utilized to ensure that we do protect the rights that they do have is essential in ensuring that individuals get a fair sort of trial out through the asylum process. So very, very important. Thank you. And you work with unaccompanied children on a daily basis. And just wanted to hear from you. You know, we've had conversations in the past about this issue and would love for you to talk a little bit about the barriers that disabled children who are unaccompanied face through the process.
Thanks, Mia, and thank you for having me here today. I'm already learning from Professor Cantor. I was taking notes to myself, so this is great. So just as some level setting, so the Young Center, as you mentioned, works with unaccompanied and separated children in the immigration system, and we have a combination of lawyers and social workers and volunteers who are appointed to serve as best interest advocates for the most vulnerable children in custody. So we don't work with all children, but we do work with children with disabilities, children whose primary language is not Spanish or English, who may be victims of trafficking, are pregnant and parenting, are tender age, or maybe aging out. So some multiple forms of vulnerabilities that we see. And although we serve unaccompanied kids, it's really all children in the immigration system who face these barriers and work and exist within a system that is not welcoming and is not child friendly. So all children, including children with disabilities, are first subjected to CBP custody, which is, again, you'll hear me repeat this, but not child-friendly, not trauma-informed, not disability-aware. Children with medical needs or other who use assistive devices can have them taken away from them. And children who are with their families are still subject to Title 42 removal and expulsion. Although if there's some sort of obvious disability, they might be granted an exception. They are children who are not with their legal guardian will be separated. And then going into the asylum process, there's no universal representation or access to counsel. And so, children and their families will be navigating a complex system without, someone to help them navigate alongside them. And the system itself is just set up in a way that it gives children and their families a very limited opportunity to really have meaningful access to legal protection. And then on a particular disability note, there's a lack of access to and understanding about what safeguards and accommodations that children might ask for and be granted. So, for example, being aware of trauma triggers or, time of day that a person's medication might be affecting them. The kind of things we might think about in representing children in a civil court system are not as well developed in the immigration system.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that it's definitely evident that unaccompanied children with disabilities have specific needs that are often not met within the system, and that your organizations like you are trying to ensure that those individuals get the services and supports that they need. So I think that's extremely important. I wanted to go a little bit farther into sort of the detention center, which is sort of where people sort of start out within the program if they're able to actually claim or try and apply to make a claim. So would love to hear from all of you sort of what are disabled people facing once they go into the detention facilities. And you talked about some of the issues of having some of the assistive equipment being taken away from them, but would love to hear a little bit more.
This is Michelle. I mean, I can start off and then go from there, I guess. When you are in a detention center, if you're a person with a disability, we've had folks who have told us that have been detained. So for those who have disabilities, they are put in solitary confinement just off the back. And they're told that it's for their own protection, quote unquote, just because of their disabilities, right? If you are a person who uses medical equipment, like a wheelchair, for example, that wheelchair is taken away, just off the back. And if you need any type of supports, that support comes to you whenever the person in solitary confinement feels like you are going to get that support. So it's not really when you need it, it's when they feel like giving it to you. So that support is really not there, is what I'm getting at. So we have worked with a couple cases, and we meaning like Access Living or the Latinx group that I used to support and still support in the work that we do, advocating for those in detention, to ensure that those individuals were getting the medications that they needed, ensuring that if they were diabetic or if they had eating restrictions, and that they needed their food or their medications at a timely manner, that they would get it. I know of an instance where we were fighting for folks to get specifically medication because they were diabetic and they were really in need of medication. We even did like a sort of like an action to prove that there was need for that medication and that food. We called media attention, and we even we called in like our senators to come into the facilities, one of the facilities that was here in Illinois, to see the conditions in which the individuals were living or being held in. And that even that media attention and that attention that we brought with the senators, the local Illinois senators, did some change, which now we don't have detention centers here in Illinois, which is great. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to get rid of the detention centers all across the board. And so what we still have people being confined to these solitary rooms and not getting the care that they need, and being told that it's for their own good, and being given the adequate supports. So I think, first of all, if you have a mental health disability or a physical disability, being in solitary confinement makes it even worse, and not getting the care because you're not getting the actual attention or care that you need. So we should definitely see other avenues of getting folks to be protected while in detention, if there needs to be detention, which I don't think so, but if they're in detention, they should be protected in other ways rather than in a solitary confinement manner. So that's what I've seen thus far, and how we've been trying to support folks who are in that situation or in those situations. And that's where I'll leave it for now. I hope I was explaining myself enough.
Yes, no, thank you so much. Professor Cantor or Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that what Michelle's talking about is also guaranteed as a legal right, that individuals have a right to accommodations and modifications. You're all familiar probably with the Americans with Disabilities Act. That covers employers, private employers. It also covers state and local governments and places of public accommodation. So in federal detention centers, the Americans with Disabilities does not apply. But if they're run by state and local entities or private entities, the ADA would apply. And if they are run by the federal government, the Rehabilitation Act still applies. So what do these laws offer? The Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, they offer the same right to accommodations and modifications of rules if those rules have basically a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. So Michelle mentioned solitary confinement. In the context of prisons, solitary confinement of people with disabilities for the safety of the individual have been found to violate the Eighth Amendment, as well as Section 504 and the ADA if state and local governments are involved in running those facilities. So that itself is challengeable. Similarly, there are other daily accommodations that people with disabilities may have in detention centers. Maybe they need sign language interpreting or written materials in texts that they could understand, not only because of a language difference, but because of a learning disability. Similarly, there are many different types of medications that can help people with disabilities. The right to medication would be considered a right under Section 504 in that context. So I think, again, it's advocates, we have a job to be aware of who is going to be detained and what the law could, how the law could help those individuals get services, accommodations, medication, and other ways of surviving that detention, I guess, to the best of their ability. I'd like to think, too, that eventually the mandate for community services that the Supreme Court upheld in Olmstead could be applied to people in detention, that they too could have a right to live in the community. But we're not there yet. But it's something really to think about, is how these laws that have been applied in different contexts could apply to people who are refugees, asylees, or immigrants in detention, because the ADA does not distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. If you're in this country, you have a right under the ADA and Section 504, depending on the context.
Thank you so much. And I am definitely going to dig in a little further with that, Professor, in a short while. But I wanted to also talk with Anne about the Rehab Act. Professor Cantor, you mentioned about it. The Rehabilitation Act under Section 504, which affects things that are federally funded. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you have sort of been somewhat involved in some class action lawsuits, or have yeah. Anyway, I'll let you explain sort of what your involvement in understanding.
Yeah, I was going to
But we'll
say
love
it's
you.
probably better to say that I track obsessively a number
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
class action
Yes.
lawsuits. Yeah, so let me give a little bit of background about the system for unaccompanied children, because it's different than the adult system. So unaccompanied and separated children will be transferred from CBP to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is an agency under Health and Human Services. ORR operates a number of different kind of placements, from foster care to shelters, large and small, to then more restrictive settings. But the summary of the system is that it is not designed with a disability lens whatsoever. It's compliance focused. It is focused on getting kids in and out quickly to a point. Most kids will spend around 30 days in custody, which is in one sense 30 days too many, but it has been longer in the past. But the kids who don't have a viable sponsor or family member in the community, or who have disabilities of often mental health varieties, or psychosocial behavioral health, that as a result of their disability manifest in behavioral ways, acting out, putting my quotation marks in. These children will spend months and years in custody, will be often placed in more restrictive placements, where medication is the norm and mental health treatment is minimal. There are, once they're in this cycle, it's very hard to get out. It's hard to be placed in less restrictive settings, or foster care, family-based placements, which is sort of a goal for those who lack a family member. So it's sort of the anti-Olmsted, I would say, that there's a real reliance on institutionalized placements. Therapeutic placements for mental health concerns is seen as a good option, rather than what we know from disability rights, from the movement of deinstitutionalization, that children, all children, and especially children with disabilities, do best at home, in home-like settings, where if a family member is not available, where the services and supports they need are provided. So yeah, so we can get into Olmsted a little bit later, but there's been use of 504 in a couple different federal litigation class actions. And one I'd really like to highlight is the Lucas R. case. And this was brought by NICL, the National Center for Youth Law, who are also counsel for the Flores settlement. And I can talk about that later if there's interest. But generally, I'll just lift them up to say that they do great and important work in this area. And LucasR has numerous claims. I've heard it described as 5 cases in one, but one of those claims is a 504 claim regarding ORR's use of restrictive settlements to segregate children who have a disability or are perceived to have a disability, and prolonging their detention. So we are optimistic that that will come out with positive changes to the ORR system that does lead, one hopes, to fewer step-ups and fewer restrictive placements. Another one to highlight is Freyhut v. ICE, which was brought by the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, or CREEC, another group I'll lift up that's doing great work. And this was regarding ICE behavior that detained immigrants with disabilities did not receive appropriate medical and mental health care. And there was punitive use of segregation, as Michelle and Professor Cantor talked about earlier. And it sort of turned into a COVID case where plaintiffs filed an emergency motion for preliminary injunction. And I'll stop myself before I get too much into legalese. But it was initially successful, and a special master was appointed, and some releases happened. There was a process for that, but unfortunately, the Ninth Circuit last year did vacate that injunction, and so it's now back at the Court of Appeal, or at the District Court, where it's presently ongoing. So I think there is room and space and rich opportunities for the use of 504 to push on disability rights issues.
Thank you so much. Professor Cantor, we've discussed we've heard about Rehab 504. That's usually the sort of legislation that is being utilized to help immigrants who are applying for asylumship. Want to hear from you, because you sort of analyzed a recent case, matter of Ricardo de Santiago Carrillo, which was the first case that established disability as a membership in a particular social group, which is a lot of legalese, but under US immigration law. Can you describe the case in as plain language as you can, and how we can potentially use all of the tools that we have at our disposal, not just 504, but also the ADA and potentially the CRPD, which is so to advocate for disabled asylum seekers. Would love to hear your thoughts. You're on mute, just FYI.
That case back in 2000 came to me from a lawyer in California who had a client with a, quote, mental illness, who was from Mexico, who had no family, no income, and was facing a return to Mexico, and would end up in an institution where people like him were called in Spanish abandonados, people who were abandoned. And Eric Rosenthal, with whom I've worked from Disability Rights International, had documented in previous years the enormous death rate among people in the Mexican mental institutions. That it was the chances of being there is that you'll die within 5 years. I mean, the mortality rate was astronomical. And so the case was made that if this man were to return, he's basically being returned to a death sentence. That's persecution, and that he should be granted asylum. In his case, ultimately, he wasn't granted asylum for a variety of reasons. He had a prior criminal conviction for the short time he was in the United States. But it opened up the thinking of myself, many people around the country, that this particular social group category should apply to people with disabilities. And since then, as I mentioned, it has been used and successfully so that people can show if they are members of this particular social group of people with disabilities, that they should be entitled to protection if they can show persecution. I want to say that the 504 gets us only so far. It provides the accommodations that people need in the process, but let's not underestimate those accommodations either, because we now have a right under the Franco decision in which the court has held that immigrants with disabilities have a right to a lawyer. And that's important, very important. And so once an individual with a disability has a lawyer, it's the lawyer's obligation, I argue, to know what they should be doing for a client with a disability. And the ADA, by the way, does apply to them. And so lawyers have to get sign language interpreters and other accommodations for a client with a disability, both in their communication with their client, but also within the context of this immigration proceeding. And so I think that this case, although we weren't successful in keeping Mr. Santiago Carrillo in the United States, we were successful in opening up the BIA's eyes, I think, and having them understand a bit that people with disabilities should qualify for certain protections. The circuits are pretty much not split, I want to say, and we don't want the Supreme Court to enter into this discussion these days, I will say, in my view. But the circuits are not as understanding of these issues, and they need help. And I think that things that our organizations, yours, the law schools can do is more judicial training around the rights of people with disabilities in the immigration and asylum context, more educating of lawyers who are being paid to represent these people or who are volunteering, and following the cases. So I did put together an article. We can maybe put it in the chat for the Human Rights Brief, a really short article that just gives you all the cases you need, kind of highlights some of these issues, and is intended to be a resource for lawyers. And I hope it'll be helpful. I'm working now on a longer law review, talk about legalese, lots of legalese, lots of footnotes, but at least is presenting some of the theories that we hope lawyers can then use. And I also want to just call out the fact that we're talking about people who are actually seeking asylum or trying not to be deported. It's the lawyer's obligation also to talk to the client to find out what legal avenues may be available. And maybe Ann can speak to this. I mean, clearly a client doesn't show up with a lawyer, especially in detention, say, hi, I should qualify for asylum. It's up to the lawyers to be developing the trust relationship that Michelle mentioned at the outset of this panel, so that they can engage in conversations with their clients to find out what avenues will protect them. And asylum may be one of them. And I don't know if I want to make a pitch too. There may not be time, so I'll make it right now. That we have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. That's an embarrassment.
Yeah.
That's an embarrassment, I think, for every American, disabled or not. So one other advocacy effort, I think, in which I'm personally and passionately involved in, is not giving up hope that the US Senate would ratify the CRPD and that we would join 184 countries around the world that already have ratified it, which would give additional legal rights and protections for people with disabilities. I'm not optimistic, but I'm certainly not giving up hope at this point.
I appreciate you pitching that, and I hope the powers that be help get that across the line. Every one of you have talked a little bit about Olmstead, in particular with the context of an understanding of solitary confinement, and then also detaining for extended periods of time unaccompanied disabled children. So I'd love to hear from you all a little bit of an explainer of what Olmstead is for folks, just in case they don't know. And then also sort of how you see Olmstead as sort of maybe the one of the legal ways to help individuals get out of the situations, whether it's solitary confinement or extended detention stays.
Sure. Professor Cantor, do you want to take the what is Olmsted or?
Oh, I mean, Olmsted's a Supreme Court decision, 1999, where the Supreme Court said that the ADA includes in its regulations an integration mandate, which means that a state cannot keep confined any individual with disability in an institution if a treating professional says, and the individual wants, they should leave. And it is an important mandate that should be implemented in every state in the country, and the Justice Department has been working to see if that happens. Take it away, Ian.
Good. I knew you could roll that off your tongue just so easily. So yes, right. I came into this immigration work with that Olmsted lens, and I think as I said, the system as it stands is kind of the anti-Olmsted, where we're restrictive placements, we're segregating, we're keeping kids longer rather than getting them to their families quickly or getting them in home and community-based settings with the supports and services they need. The solutions are, I don't know, I kind of think of it as a universal design model, right? A system that prioritizes getting kids to families quickly, not separating kids from trusted family members, that is trauma-informed, that funds home and community-based placements, is a system that works for children with disabilities, but it works for all kids, right? And that's kind of our vision at the Young Center. I think is one where a system that works through an Olmsted lens of keeping kids at home or community-based settings is in the best interest of all children.
This is Michelle, if I may add, and not just for children, I mean, I think adults as well. If we have home and community-based services for folks, they would not have to deal with returning back to their countries where they're, like Dr. Cantor said, they go to die basically, because in many of these countries, they're not going to receive the healthcare that they need. If they go into an acute setting of a hospital, or if they need acute care, they are more likely to get it here in this country than they are to get it in their country of origin. I see cases of folks that need more acute care, and they're likely more to get it here if they were to stay, even if they're undocumented, than if they were to go back home to wherever home is, because they're sending them back to die, basically, like there was mentioned before. We work a lot with folks trying to get them home and community-based services. Right now, we are working because in Illinois, we just passed a law that provides Medicaid for all undocumented individuals from 41 and up. So those individuals, undocumented individuals who are ages 41 and up, are getting the opportunity to get Medicaid and get the healthcare that they need. However, there is a caveat that it does not cover home and community-based services like regular Medicaid would, but we're in that fight that it should cover home and community-based services, because for folks with disabilities, we know that home and community-based services, like Anne and Dr. Cantor said, those are very necessary needs that people have, right? In order to live full and independent lives, or interdependent, like I call them, lives, we need home and community-based services.
Thank you so much. I am opening it up to some questions that we're getting from the audience. And one of those questions, and I think this is sort of the essential point of this event, is to understand sort of what do we need to be doing in order to ensure that, well, one, why is it important for disability and immigration groups to communicate? And then two, what do we need to do to improve that communication? So it's sort of a two-part question. Michelle, I know you just spoke, but would love to hear,
Sure.
because you are doing some community work, would love to hear from you first.
Sure, of course. So I think it's very important that disability rights groups and immigration rights groups come together and speak to each other, because for example, I still see it, that disability rights groups don't see that immigration is part of disability rights, and vice versa. I'm at tables where immigration is talked about, but they don't see disability as an issue or as part of the issue. So I'm like, hello, we're here. There's immigrants with disabilities, and this is why the organizing group that I helped organize are at the table, because we need them to see that there's immigrants with disabilities across the board that need that support. And so these two groups of organization or groups of folks who work on these issues, immigration and disability, need to understand that there's that intersectionality of work, that we need to start working together, that they're not separate issues, that we need to start working as if it's one issue, in order for it to be able to be successful. Because if we start working on it separately, we're not going to get anywhere. Unfortunately, that's how it's going to be. And we cannot be competing for, like the laws on disability or or we're successful on immigration laws. We need to make sure that the immigration laws that are being passed include individuals with disabilities. And we need to ensure that disability laws that are being passed include immigrants with disabilities. Did I make sense, or did I confuse folks? Sometimes I get confused.
No, definitely. That was perfect. That was perfect. I think, I would also like to hear from both Anne and Professor Cantor about sort of both of you have spoken to me, at least, about sort of specific legislation that you're hoping to get passed, and wanted to hear from you sort of what that legislation is and sort of how you could see it impacting individuals going into the future.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll jump in on that one and talk about something that we at the Young Center are pretty excited about, which is the Children's Safe Welcome Act, which was just introduced into Congress, spearheaded by Senator Merkley and Congresswoman Bass. It strengthens and supports the protections for unaccompanied children. And again, with this vision, I would say that we have that unaccompanied children shouldn't be separated from their families, so that they should be able to stay with trusted family members, so minimal family separation. But for the small amount of children who might need to be in custody for a short amount of time because they are truly alone or because there's some other issue at play, we need to get a system in place that prioritizes their best interest. And so some of the things that the CSWA does, the Children's Safe Welfare Act, is phase out large congregate facilities. Some of them now are, more than 500 beds, right? So it's no place for a child. To prioritize kids with disabilities for release and for home and community-based placements and services, to strengthen supports in the community, and that all children have access to counsel who will zealously represent them. As Professor Cantor said, there's a real role and importance here for lawyers to really get up to speed on disability rights issues. And so we're pretty excited about this. If you're interested, get in touch, uplift on social media, and who knows with the government that we have, how things will go. But we are excited to really push for statutory protection because so much of immigration policy is set by the executive and is really vulnerable to changing administrations, changing the political scene, just the winds of the news. So a chance to get real statutory protections in is a key goal of ours.
Thank you. Professor Cantor, giving you the last word. Yeah, I know. You talked a little bit about the CRPD and how it could maybe help in the asylum process. But wanted to hear from you sort of two things. One is, why should we pass or sign on to the CRPD? And why are people saying we shouldn't? And what's the argument against their argument? You're muted again.
President Obama committed when he ran for office that he would sign it. And shortly after he was sworn in as president, he did sign the CRPD. But what happens then is that it goes to the Senate that has to ratify it. And on 2 occasions, the Senate refused to ratify it. I'll get to why they refused in a minute, but I should say first why we should ratify it. Because number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, most countries in the world and every other country that we ever compare ourselves to has already ratified it. And number three, it confirms what we say is our commitment against ableism and for integration and inclusion of people with disabilities through the ADA. So there is no legal, I think, moral or common sense reason not to ratify this treaty. And that's not legalese. That's really from our hearts and soul. Legally, the reason that people say they shouldn't ratify it is because they misrepresent what ratifying the CRPD means. And I hate to say it, I've written an article and I looked very carefully at every sentence opponents made during the ratification hearings, and unfortunately had to call out some that were outright lies. There is a misimpression that by ratifying the CRPD, for example, that parents won't have a say anymore about where their children should go to school, because the CRPD recognizes a right to an inclusive education system. It doesn't interfere with a parent's right to decide what's best for their child. And yet the Senate opponents argued that and convinced some people, after a lot of lobbying, to not ratify the CRPD, that it would interfere with parental rights regarding education. There is no reason, as I said, I've reviewed every sentence in both hearings, that there is no reason that the CRPD should not be ratified, that it doesn't interfere with American law, it doesn't undermine American law, that it only enhances American law. And I hope that we'll have a Senate that will see that, will read through the misstatements and falsehoods and understand the truth and importance of joining every other country in the world, recognizing that people with disabilities are human beings with rights like everyone else. It's about time, don't you think?
Thank you so much. No, I totally agree. I think one of the things that I hope attendees have gotten from this is to understand that there's multiple tools that disabled and any immigrant coming to the US has specific rights, and that organizations and lawyers have sort of the need to ensure those rights are protected, and to utilize every sort of tool in the toolbox that they have in order to ensure that individuals have these rights protected. So again, want to thank you all so much for coming and speaking at this event today. I do want to highlight that we are going to have a piece that is going to come out in the next couple weeks that sort of summarizes some of this conversation into a report form. If you are interested in being able to read that, feel free to sign up to our email listserv. You can choose to follow both the Disability Justice Initiative articles and also the immigration articles, so you can get information from both sides. Again, want to thank everybody so much. Want to thank the captioners and also the ASL interpreters for all that you have done today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Oh, thank you.